Okay, cool. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
Hi. It's wonderful to see your face and officially like e-meet you.
Yay.
Yeah, we've been emailing and talking on the phone a bit.
Mhm.
Um, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself and then do a land acknowledgement on behalf of Fringe and then introduce you, and then we can
Thanks.
just get to chatting. So, to everyone tuning in, hi, my name is Kitoko Mai. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm an artist based in Hamilton, Ontario. Um, the territory on which I live and work is the traditional territories of the Erie, the Neutral, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Agreement, which is an agreement made between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the land. Um, Hamilton Fringe Festival Company has been in conversation with many Indigenous like artists and communities, including like working with elders to um, figure out like what it really means as like a theater company to be working on this land and how to align themselves with um, Indigenous peoples. And so for folks like listening in, like if this is your first time like hearing a land acknowledgement, um, or if this is like your 100th time hearing that acknowledgement because they happen often before like special events, um, we want to um, take this opportunity to extend like the invitation to like really reflect on what it means for you as like an individual to be on this land. Like what lands do you come from, um and like um yeah, so I'm trying to keep this like a short, like not because I could talk for a while, but um to really just reflect on like especially like in the like greater like discourse, like where you fit in this conversation. I think that sometimes it's easy to just hear and like think that that's enough and that you don't have to go home and do any work and like try to understand like what it really means. But I really encourage you to like do some research and learn more, um, because it's really important and you're not, no one is exempt from the conversation. um, yeah, so today we have Lisa Cooke Ravensburgen. I'm going to read Lisa's bio. A tawny mix of Ojibwe and Swampy Cree and English Irish, Lisa resides as a visitor on unceded Coast Salish territory, aka Vancouver. She is a mother, a multi-hyphenate theater artist, and scholar whose work is rooted in Indigenous protocols, ontologies, and anti-colonial methodologies, and is recognized for its rigor and artistic excellence. Lisa is an associate artist with Full Circle, First Nations Performance, and playwright in residence with Delinquent Theatre. Most recently, she founded the Mata da Unawag Canadian Anti-Racist Theatre Exchange, an IBPOC-centered resistance and anti-racist mobilization that focuses on disrupting the colonial project called Canadian Theatre. Hi, Lisa.
Hi. Thanks for
it,
having me.
Thanks for being here.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I know I just introduced you, but I wondered if there was anything outside of your bio that you wanted to also mention about yourself. Either, yeah.
Ah, well, I can introduce myself in the language. Ani and Bojo for any fellow Anishinaabe out there. Gamino b'mada zidakwe Nidishnikaz, Makwani Dodem, Parents River, Nindunjaba, and Vancouver, North Vancouver, Ninda. I'm here raising my family in unceded occupied territories. And my name, I carry the name Gamino B'Madazidakwe, she who walks in a good way. Which when I got the name, I thought, oh great, it set me up to fail. So I've been aspiring to stay on the path, and when I've left it, I've been very grateful to carry the name to remind me who I'm moving towards myself, and how I can move towards myself, my future self. And I'm Bear Clan, and my family comes from Manitoba and Ontario. My father's was born in Barons River, Manitoba. So, and I grew up for much of my teen life in just outside of Hamilton, in Winona.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that area very, very, very well. Yeah.
Yeah. I know that when I first invited you to talk, we were going to be exploring like decolonizing your artistic practice. And so one of my first questions, like we heard a bit about your artistic practice in your bio. I'm curious about how your identities and like lived experiences have influenced your artistic practice.
Mm.
And then it's sort of like, I'm also interested in how decolonization informs your artistic practice and what it means for you.
Right. Those are such big questions. They're good questions, but they're big questions. Well, I think, like any of us who are growing up and getting older, I think a lot of who I am now as an artist is because when I was a younger artist, I was trying to figure out what my questions were and trying to figure out how I could best answer those questions. And inevitably, it led me to better questions and another try at doing it better. And I guess there is a big part of me that over the years I've learned and am learning that I don't know that I believe decolonizing is possible. Just like I'm highly suspicious of this idea of reconciliation. Because I think the way that we as a nation of supposed Canadians understand those kind of notions, I think we've all been taught and educated to understand it to be assimilation, and when it has to do with Indigenous people. So I think when people hear reconciliation, they by default just think, well, assimilation. So we're just all supposed to then default to that settler reality, and in service to the settler comfort of what that might mean or look like, whether they're practitioners or producers or presenters or audience. And I feel, and my experience has been that I keep thinking of theater as a space that really occupies us. And that every time, we enter into theater spaces, we are essentially recolonizing ourselves. That theater in and of itself is a system that replicates and ensures the longevity and the existence of a structure called theater that is introduced to this territory through colonial visioning and structures and rules and demands. So I feel in lots of ways that my work is to extricate myself from the duplicity and the complexity of my own recolonizing, and to understand and reckon with my own complicity in my own colonial defaults and my own colonial way of thinking and relating to people. And alongside that has been my ongoing cultural practice in my family, but also in my community. And mostly right now, when I say community, I mean more of an urban reality and urban community. And also I'm a visitor here on Coast Salish territories. And so there's another layer of, I feel, obligation to be a good visitor, which is to learn the protocols of this land and to understand my role in that reciprocal action of existing here and learning those protocols and honoring them and practicing them in a good way. So that's a really quick way of starting to answer your question.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. I feel like I had like 10 questions as you were talking. Yeah, I'm curious about when you talk about how engaging with theater can result in you having to like in you like recolonizing yourself. Like, I guess I'm curious, like when you're saying that, like what do you mean? Like what has that looked like, or what parts of theater have been like recolonizing or required that? Does that make sense as a question?
I think so. Like, I think of it as like, I've been saying it lately, the last few years, I've been saying that theater is like a relic of dispossession.
Hmm.
In the same way that, you go to, like, I've traveled to Europe, for instance, and I've gone to some of the old churches and they have these relics of saints, and it's like their finger joint or their lock of hair or, their eyeball or whatever, some part of them. Oh yeah, it's really interesting. And they're very precious and they're very sacred and they're very protected, and they're sacred relics of their saints or their spiritual leaders that they honor as a way to uphold those institutions like the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or monarchy or, whatever, however that person is situated. And so I think for me that theater is its own relic, and it is a relic of dispossession because it does require me to abandon my own maybe ancestral knowledge and my own ancestral ways of being that
Mm-hmm.
are still alive in me, even though I'm not an ancestor yet. I'm a future ancestor. That it really asks me to value, for instance, Aristotle's storytelling structure, the hero's journey, that there's these structures, these bone structures, ligaments that are sacred to what we understand to be theater in terms of like when we go to school and learn about, or when we go to plays, like there's a social hierarchy around the globe, when that's replicated here through Stratford and Shaw, and then through that's the regional theaters like Soulpepper and the Arts Club out here in Vancouver. So we have these like almost like those nesting dolls of replication around those larger structures that define for us as a quote unquote nation what theater is, and therefore what is valued in terms of story, what is valued in terms of voice, what's valued in terms of look, like appearance, like beauty, in terms of gender. So those notions around identity are they're very aligned with these larger ideas about what structures like theater are built upon. Theater is built upon a system of supremacy because it replicates supremacist stories. That's what his original intent was here in Turtle Island, right? It wasn't to tell Black stories. It wasn't to tell Indigenous stories. It wasn't to tell women's stories. It wasn't to tell non-binary, gender diverse, neurodiverse stories. It's very much streamlined very specifically through systems of representation that are also funded through other systems. So those systems reinforce the systems that then reinforce these systems that you and I then go to school to learn. And then when we come out of school, or maybe we don't go to school, maybe we just start, performing or writing or dancing or singing, And I feel like at some point, whether we're audience or whether we're artists or collaborators, that I think there's a reciprocal action to all of those ancestors, including all of those little tiny bodies that were, people are finally acknowledging are buried beneath school grounds. That that act of reciprocation is really about saying, well, where has my complicity allowed for these systems to replicate and replicate and replicate, and where inside that can I claim my own sovereignty? Can I assert my agency separate from that system, because we're in the system.
Mm-hmm.
The system isn't going to go anywhere unless you're, like you asked me the other day, if I'm an abolitionist. I'm like, I probably am way more abolitionist than I realize I am, because
Mm-hmm.
in a way, to get that kind of, I don't think it's a pure state, but to sort of get to a place where, replication of systems doesn't happen, it means the systems can't be there to be replicated. But I don't know that we're actually wired that way, because even for me, there's cultural systems that I'm obligated to and that I honor, and allow me to move forward into the future with hope, and with accountability. So did I answer the question?
You definitely did.
Okay.
Yeah, you definitely did. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up school as well, because I think I sometimes feel like the way that I created art before I started school and the way that I create art after school, like I feel like it took so much out of me. It took so much of my voice, and I really like being complicit in that, like recolonizing of yourself. Like I really like fell into that. I want to call it a trap, but I don't know if trap is the right word, but I really fell into that sunken place. But as like you've like grown like an awareness of that and of like the ways that you've been complicit, like has there been like a project that you worked on where you felt like, oh, this is like definitely like a step outside of that, like I'm creating work that nourishes me and makes me feel like, I know you said that decolonization maybe can't exist, hopefully yet, but like is there a piece of work that you've done or a project you've worked on where you're like, this is a step closer?
Yeah, I think every work I've ever made has been about that.
Yeah.
I think I just made that choice for myself. Doesn't mean I was necessarily successful. Doesn't mean that I was necessarily the best collaborator. Doesn't mean that I did it well. But I think part of that process for me was also reckoning and acknowledging my own the harm that I have done, or the ill-intentioned efforts created a different kind of conflict than maybe I was trying to avoid. And I guess for me, I kind of made a contract in a way with myself that when I went to theater school, it was my second degree. And I had been told in my first degree, which was an English and theater degree, that basically I was a terrible actor, and I wasn't gonna have a career, basically. And so I believed them. And I did theater through community instead. And, I did these little paid gigs for improv, for fun. And they were very like, just like, sure, I'll come, I'll do that thing. And off I go. And I have my like real job and my real, career, my life or whatever. And so I think that there's been something for me when I went back to school, when I was because I studied at SFU, and at the time, it's a much longer story. I'll tell you the story another time. But in that process, they basically were like, why are you here? Why here? And I said, well, I guess I have one question I want to answer. And they said, what's that? And I said, is it possible for me to exist on stage? And me meaning somebody that looks like me, because I had never seen me on stage. The only time I'd ever seen somebody that looked anything like me on stage was when I saw Margot Kane do her Moon Lodge show at Women in View Festival. And I didn't
Mhm.
even know what it was. I just remember grabbing my husband's, at the time, my husband, arm and saying, that's what I've been trying to do. That's what I want to do. And he was like, well, what is it? And I was like, I don't know. Whatever she just did, whatever that was, I want to do more of that, or I want to learn, how to do that thing that Margot just
Mhm.
did and affected me the way that she just affected, like told a story in that way. And so I think for me, my career has ultimately been various ways of trying to answer that question. Is it possible for me to, somebody like me, somebody who looks like me, somebody that thinks like me, somebody who carries the stories and the baggage, can somebody like me exist and on stage? And I've had many different answers to that question. But I think when I'm in the privileged position to be able to make my own work and to be able to offer that publicly, it's very much, I think, connected still to that initial kind of impulses, like the curiosity, like, is it actually really possible to be that present and
Mhm.
that powerful and that unapologetic, about being. And
Mhm.
I think especially as women,
Mhm.
especially women of color, I think that that's a very alive question,
Mhm.
not just in theater, but I think particularly in theater. It's still
Mhm.
true. And it was true before I even showed up. I mean, my mentors and my elders, the women that have supported me along the way, Yvette Nolan and Margot Kane and Marie Clements, and so many other women of color and Indigenous women, they're all telling me, oh yeah, we've been asking that our whole careers too. So there's a lineage of exclusion that folks like you and I are
Mhm.
following, in their footsteps. And they did a lot of that without the kind of presence and support that you and I have been, I feel like, honored to be witness to and hear about. Even if we don't necessarily get to see it, we get to hear about that, that it exists and that those women
Mhm.
exist and that those voices and those stories are being told to the varying degrees, of success or curiosity that they may be offered. And I feel like that's like just the fact that you and I can have this conversation. When I went to theater school, I would never have thought that you and I, people who look like us, people that think like us,
Mhm.
that anybody would even care,
Mhm.
you know, that
Yeah.
that you exist, Kitoko, like nobody, who cares? So it
Yeah.
feels like such a beautiful gift to just see you, just to see
Oh,
you.
yeah. No, it definitely does feel like such a privilege. And I feel like I remember I was part of a mentorship program for like artist producers. And I remember one of the people who was like offering us mentorship. I remember that she admitted that she kind of felt like very excited that we were getting that mentorship, but also sad for her like younger self who like didn't
Yeah,
get
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if that's something that you ever feel as like an artist or as like a mentor to people.
I was very, very fortunate. I had really great mentors.
Mm-hmm.
And I also went back to school, so I was a little bit older.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd already had a kind of the start of a career where I was very much mentored. I was the baby in that group of
Mm-hmm.
people, and they really kind of just took care of me. Um, so it's a one thing I love about our community, is that we're really good at mentoring. And as much as sometimes we're really good at not taking care of each other, we're also really good, I think, about um, holding each other when we need that. And so some of those women that I mentioned, and there's some other men too, but I feel like I've been very, very fortunate that
Mm-hmm.
I was very right from the beginning, even before I finished theater school. Margot Kane and I started the Talking Stick Festival together, um, and uh, and that opened up automatically just opened up a community of connection
Mm-hmm.
for me that
Mm-hmm.
And it's just because I just happen to have, a certain kind of skill set that allowed me to be a contributing community member very quickly. I think it's harder if you're not quite sure what your skills are, or if you're not quite sure, or if you're not maybe as practiced at your skills or at what you think you might be able to offer a room. I think it's a bit trickier for folks to know or to feel confident about how to ask for that help, or who to get that support from, or to even recognize what actual support looks like. And I love mentoring. I've mentored my whole career, and I think part of it is I feel like that's part of my social obligation back to the community. And I think it's also part of culturally how it's done. I think how people learn is they learn from watching and talking to people who are older than them, or just more experienced or have skills that you don't have. So I think it's a bit trickier for folks who maybe aren't familiar with that kind of cultural practice, or have yet to sort of really be given or put themselves in positions where they get to kind of practice and fail and practice and fail and practice and fail in a supportive way, where the failure is really about learning, and repairing and reaffirming the things that, I don't need that to show up in this kind of work that I'm doing. I actually need to bring this part of myself. And what do I need to do to strengthen myself so I can bring that better part of myself, rather than this other part of myself that's either, insecure or self-doubting or toxic or laterally violent or controlling, or whatever it is that disrupts kind of healthy collaboration. So I think part of what's great about mentorship is that if you can find those people who are willing to kind of encourage you and support you and equip you when you're in the flailing of the falling and the failing and the I don't know and the questioning, who just go, yeah, that's normal. Here, do it this way, or here's some support. Just be you, try it again. Why don't you try it again? Here's a way. Here's an opportunity. Do you want to try it again? I think that's one of the best. I feel like, anyway, now as a more senior artist, I feel like that's something that was modeled to me, and I hope that I'm better at that than I was 20 years ago. That kind of generosity, because I don't think I've always been that generous. I've been, I know I haven't been. So the practice of that has taken me 20 years, if longer. It's taken me longer than 20 years, but definitely inside my practice, it's been a very conscious effort, I guess, on my part.
It's interesting to hear. Generosity is, I feel like, difficult, but I like that you defined it as like a practice, like something to like put effort into and continue to like work on and develop. And you talked a bit about like looking at failure as like an opportunity to like grow versus kind of like oh, you failed, bad on you. And I feel like when it comes to like conversations about things like decolonization, I think a lot of people are afraid to engage because of the fear of failure. And I wondered, like the fear of failure, the fear of like causing harm. And I wonder, like, because earlier you said that like there have been times where you've like made mistakes and failed. I wonder if there are any like mistakes that you've made that you'd be willing to talk about and talk about how it like contributed to your growth or didn't. If it didn't, you could also pass.
I think I'm trying to think. There's been many. So I'm like, how humble do I want to be? I remember this one time early in my career, Margot and I were working on Talking Stick Festival, and she had asked me to, we'd sort of split up. There was a group, you know, that we had all these different artists, and so we kind of split. We're like, well, you work with those ones and I'll work with these ones. And we're really kind of directing and dramaturging, but also just kind of supporting either the idea or the actual piece that the people were doing. And I happen to be working with a group of singers who are part of a family and an extended family. And they're from close to this territory. But they all, I think almost all of them at the time, they all lived in Vancouver. And, you know, they were siblings and, you know, married partners, and the grandmother, like the matriarch for the family, and there were some kids there too. And I I remember this one time, I don't know if it came from me. I think part of it did. There was this kind of, I think I was giving off an energy of like this kind of urgency, like it had to be good, you know, because it's about to be in front of this really big audience, and there's a bunch of settler people there, and, you know, you got to be your best, you know. And so I think part of that was me. And part of it also was this idea of rigour that I picked up from school, that you had to kind of keep doing things over and over and over and over and over, and you don't really discuss it, that you just kind of like listen to the person who's kind of outside, and you just kind of say yes, thank you, and you kind of do the thing. And so I think it was probably a combination of me creating kind of this external pressure unconsciously, and also consciously, because Margot had come in, I remember at one point, and we were both a bit like, are they gonna, you know, how do we help them, because they're not ready, you know, to do this in, you know, in front of other people. And I think that there's something even just about that idea that I tend not to think so much anymore, like this idea like, oh, they're not ready. I'm starting to think of it more like, well, what are they offering, and how can I accommodate what they're able to offer, and how much more can I ask of the group, whoever it is. And it means that I don't get to think about me, that I actually have to release my own expectations or my own sort of standards of artistic excellence, you know, for the sake of honoring what is actually present in the room. And so for them at one point, it just everything collided, and they had this massive family blowout. Like I felt like I was at a family reunion. And
oh no.
And it went totally sideways, and like screaming. I thought two of them were gonna like beat each other up. Like it was obviously old stuff, you know, had come. And it was just that pressure of like, oh my God, we have to do this in front of people. And we're not agreeing. And I hate you. Because you always do this to me when the pressure comes down, right? And you always do this when the pressure comes down. And so, and I just was like this young artist watching this family like explode and implode, and everyone was doing their family system, you know, they were all taking on the roles that they have in their family. And I somehow, I don't even remember how, but I just remember like I kind of was like, let's take a break. But at that point, the flow, like the energy in the room was its own thing, you know. And I think what happened for me in hindsight is I recognize, and there's some other failures along the way in some other collaborations where I realized, oh, I have I like to think that I'm process oriented, but I'm actually really product driven and process oriented. And so at some point I abandoned the process for the sake of the product, and they really felt the pressure of that.
Yeah.
And we shifted out of this sort of open kind of collaborative like flow of ideas and fun, and it was like, okay, we got to run it again, we got to do this again, you have to be there, why aren't you there, let's do this, let's try it again, Lisa doesn't want that, she wants this, but we all agree, blah blah blah. And then suddenly there was a lot of that, the two kind of pressures just collided in a way that created this big explosion. And I really have had to reckon with the way that I have not managed that well for myself, and how it has really, in some instances, made future collaborations actually impossible with certain artists, where we just will never work together again. And some of that was me, and some of that was laid on me that wasn't all as much maybe as me as maybe some would like it to be, or I'm understanding maybe I don't have to take it all on. But these other parts I really should take on, and I really need to address in my own practice. So yeah, so I can, like, I feel like that's been a big learning for me out of a number of different. I had to learn it not a couple, but I think probably I think 3 times, where I didn't clock that that's what was happening. And then one of the people that one of these times, she and I happen to be going, we're still colleagues and we're still friends, but there was a period of time where we weren't. And I realized, oh, I really value her, and I want to stay connected to her, even if we never work together again. I want to make sure that, and so I brought in another friend who happened to be a GM at a theater, and that's partly where I clocked that discrepancy that I had in my own practice unconsciously. And I was really grateful. I'm still grateful to her for both of them, for making that space and time for me to, and they were both very loving with me about, like, kind of calling that to my attention. Like, there's, you say this, but then you do that. What is that discrepancy about? And why do you do that? Because it actually is kind of harmful, and it hurts me, and I don't trust you when you do that, when you kind of code switch like that. And I was just like, I no, my everything in me was like, no, I don't do that. I was like, no, like, and they were saying it in a way that allowed me to hear the hard truth of that. And so I feel like that's part of what good mentorship is. It's being able to, I think, invite in those bigger structures and say, look, this is what you're up against. This is kind of the ugly truth. This is the impossible wall to scale. And at the same time, who needs the wall? And how can you, in your own unique way, how can you presence yourself and be who you are, in spite of, despite all these different structures, internal structures and external and ancestral and historical structures? How can you, I guess that's kind of what I mean by failing at that, like going, I don't know, and thinking you're making work that really you're not. You're getting there, but you're not really doing the thing you think you're doing yet. I think that's also hard for younger artists. I felt that way too. I felt like, oh, I'm changing the world, and really I was just doing a lot of navel gazing, but asking good questions. But I was really trying to answer. I was really trying to change me. And so I think every project that I've done where I've been a lead artist or the artist, the writer or maker or whatever, I think has been, in a way, sort of at some point sort of reinvesting in that process of personal growth and also artistic growth, in terms of my practice and how to be generous to myself, how to be generous to what's happening in the room. Yeah, and then trying again, I guess. I'm really grateful when people have allowed me to try again, or when people have given me the chance, or themselves the chance, to try again. And they've done their own processing that's allowed for a new kind of space for us to coexist in. It hasn't happened. I know that I've had some people think that they're offering that to me, and I realized in hindsight, I was like, oh, they were just kind of auditioning me. But they hadn't really made different space for me. They were just sort of, it was a test, that I was doomed to fail, because they were just sort of waiting for me to let them down again or something. So I think all those what is the word, machinations. I think
Yeah.
I think we all have stories of that. I think the longer we do this practice, the more we start to find where our affinities lie within ourselves and culturally, and in resistance and disruption to these bigger systems and notions. And then if we're lucky, we find those artists that hold that space for us, and then if we're extra lucky, we find people that we can actually create that space with. And it feels like that's part of what my practice has been. And also from necessity, when I came out of school, it was kind of me. And then there were a few of us who graduated through studio, I think a year or two after me. But their practice, their trajectory was different than mine. I right away went into sort of more collective kind of space making and, festival curation, that kind of stuff. So it's a bit different than having my own shows or my own solitary practice. Right away, my practice from the beginning has been communally based.
Yeah. I was going to say, it definitely sounds like you're part of a community, and part of a community that's like committed to watching you grow and creating the space for you to grow.
Yeah, I think so. I've been very fortunate that way.
Yeah. That's amazing. We're at 4:50. I just want to quickly check in to see if we have any questions from people who might be viewing the stream. That's great, because I do have a question. That's okay. We don't have questions so far, but I have one. Yeah. As we've been talking, I feel like I've been hearing a lot about how community has shaped your practice and also like helped you like grow beyond like what institutions can do, because they're constantly like forcing you to recolonize yourself. We're short on time, so I have two questions, and you can just pick which one you want to answer. One question I have is about how you, like, if you still work within like institutions, and how you resist or advocate for yourself or push for something beyond what they're expecting when it comes to like a more colonial idea of like what theater or live performance is. The other question I have is about whether you identify with being an activist or an artist activist, slash, if you do, does that feel like that term is something that's been placed onto you versus like something you voluntarily decided to do? Yeah.
Those are good questions. You're a good question person.
Thank you.
Question maker. The question maker in me appreciates that in you.
Yay.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, it's not something I necessarily think of right away. I always think of myself as being more of a moderate person that way, but ultimately, I don't think I really am. I like to think of myself more as an activator, that I'm really interested in activating spaces in new ways and activating form in new ways and activating curiosity. So I tend to think about it that way. I tend to think about it a bit more like an actor, I guess, like the verb. And so it inevitably disrupts. It inevitably shifts. It inevitably relocates and intervenes expectations and needs and timelines and, all of that kind of stuff. And I do definitely have relationships with institutions. I do teach on occasion. And I would say that so far it's been kind of a hit and miss in terms of what I bring to the academy. Because I call it the academy. And they need me to call it the academy. And I just don't. And it's a longer story. We can talk about it another time. maybe, but I was teaching at a theater program for a little while. I did a one class in particular, and really just went for it. Really just went for kind of a decolonial kind of, it was sort of one of their theory classes, and I introduced my own kind of theory structure around theatrical indigeneity. I think I used it as a baseline for an essay I did for Howl Round. And I created an audio essay, kind of based on some research I did in my master's work that I did, but also as part of that experience of teaching that class. And I had these 5 protocols of theatrical indigeneity, which were ways in which that was one of my many tiny little offers of how can you reconsider this notion of a decolonial lens on theater. And so I offered it to the class, and ultimately some students reported me to the dean.
What?
Oh yeah, it was a good time. And I feel like since that time, I've had a number of different conversations with institutions, and I've had a number of people interestingly say to me, I don't know if we're ready for you. And I think, what does that even mean? I just feel like it's a bit of a cop-out, because I'm like, well, how is any institution ready for anybody? I don't, so I feel like it's more a reflection on where academics may be around change, just what that means to relocate their positionality, to power and to knowledge, the power that knowledge brings. If it's an alternate form of knowledge, then yeah, it's just interesting about that.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I'm so curious about that class you led, why people were like, what?
It's a much longer question,
Yeah.
a much longer answer. And I think ultimately it was just I very much consciously made it very not typical second year theater school class. And so and I really embedded Indigenous ways of knowledge production, which they misinterpreted as, oh, I'm not prepared at all, and I'm making them do all of the work, as one example. And so and the dean, who I already had a relationship with because we'd been collaborators earlier in my career, he was familiar with me. So it's not like I went in like, you're a bad person, you're in trouble. But the way that the institution functions, they had to follow through. And so I had to, have these conversations with the folks. And also, yeah, I also think that, I have a master's degree, but typically in theater, to teach at the academy, you need like an MFA or a PhD. But for us, it's MFA usually. Yeah. But I didn't want an MFA because I found the way that we talk about theater, it wasn't actually interesting to me, and it wasn't actually it wasn't helping my brain grow. I felt like my brain was atrophying a bit. And so I went to Queen's because a colleague and a friend was, he was this Canada research chair there at Queen's. And he's the only person in all of Canada that I felt like understands my practice-based research. And they do practice-based research degrees there. And they're one of very few institutions that do that. And so at the time, and so at this point, I'm the only Indigenous theater artist in the country that has this degree, and yet it wasn't enough to get me on a short list. That because, and the argument back was, well, if only she had an MFA. So there's this kind of limited scope in terms of how we're in this transitional, transformative time where we are not there yet. And yet there's these calls out for these kinds of tenure track or like these fast track positions in the academy. But there's actually a lack of recognition of what that actually, like for me to do that, it means I would have had to go to an institution with a supervisor who wasn't as well suited for me in my particular practice, just so I could do this
Teach.
teaching job when actually I feel like I'm a better teacher in the ways of what I think I know and what I understand, because I went that other route where I
Mm-hmm.
had much more of an interdisciplinary
Mm-hmm.
theoretical research kind of foundation. So yeah, it's definitely its own system for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I'm
Um,
still navigating it, still trying to figure it out.
yeah. I feel like I'd be honored to have you as a professor. Like, wow, I could listen to you talk
uh,
forever.
well, thank you. And I see
Um,
that there's a question.
there is. So, something we've talked a lot about in Frostbites last year in developing this festival, this year with different activists and change makers, is asking the question of what they need from the communities of work they work within to rest and to feel nourished. What makes you feel nourished, and what do you feel like you need from your community so you can accept space to rest?
Well, that's a hard question to ask a mother. Well, let me tell you. Um, I just premiered a new work called The Seventh Fire at the Push Festival, and Delinquent Theater were the producers. They're a tiny little company, and really it was primarily Christine Quintana who held that space as a producer and co-dramaturg with Laura McLean. Um, and I feel like what I feel like we all need more of is time,
Mm,
and that we need more, and that requires more funding, because it means that a project that, and COVID got in the way, and we pivoted a number of times for a lot of different reasons, and COVID was part of that. But a process that we thought would take us maybe 2 years, it took us 7.
well,
And the kind of oh no, my computer's gonna die soon.
it's
Um,
okay.
yeah, so I feel like the funding that and the permission from those funding sources to be able to pivot according to everyone's
Mm-hmm.
physical and spiritual and mental needs in the
Mm-hmm.
space. That means, yeah, we are not going to work for 4 months. We work for 1 month, and we work part-time, and we're going to
Mm-hmm.
save this money, and we're going to put it later when we're not all doing 7 jobs at once, and we're all going to take a trip and relax and take a break from each other, and we're going to come back at it, and we're only going to work for a week.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to have that kind of support, and the flexibility in the funding, and the flexibility in the programming of companies to be able to sustain that kind of flexion. I don't know if that's
Mm-hmm.
even the word, but I think allows the permission to accept the space to rest, because
Mm-hmm.
everybody is doing it. It's not just in service to one or two, it's collectively as a group. You're all caring and clocking what everybody needs to feel cared for,
Mm-hmm.
and it just needs more time and space, and therefore funding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that really resonates. And I mean, speaking of time, we're already a little bit over. So thank you for
Okay.
giving us an extra 2 minutes of your time.
No, it's my
Um,
pleasure.
yeah, thank you so much for participating in our first conversation as part of the series. I hope that a lot of people were able to just like sit with what you said and like learn a lot. And I hope that this was an enjoyable experience for you too.
Yes, thank you.
Um, yeah. So, I mean, we can like quickly check out like what's one thing you're gonna do to take care of yourself for the rest of the day.
I'm gonna drink a ton of water.
Mm-hmm.
I have not drank enough water today, and I can feel it. I've been in, this is my 3rd meeting today, so I'm realizing my brain's been on fire. So I gotta. What about you? What are you gonna do?
I will also drink water because I don't do that enough. This will be my first time drinking water this week. So yeah, I'm not great at
Get
that.
on it. Get on it.
Will do.
I think
But
I'm also gonna go outside. Yeah,
love that.
I'm gonna do as well. By a tree. Go by the trees and the water.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome. Sounds lovely. Okay. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye.